Hey everybody. I am making this video on my phone because if you saw my message, I'm having internet issues, and even when I use my phone as a hotspot, it's just not letting me get on Zoom. So I'm making this video to go along with the assignment for poem number 4, which is our only form poem. Now, most of you have probably noticed or recall my saying that all of the poems that we work on this semester are going to be free form, which means that you really can format it any way you like. It can be any length. It doesn't have to follow any particular formula or any particular rhyme scheme or meter. And the reason for that is to allow you to focus on getting your ideas on the page without the constraints of all of that other stuff. So I do want you to have the experience of writing a form poem though at some point in the semester. So what we're going to do is 1. That's what we're doing for poem number 4. You have a choice between 2 types of poems. One is the sestina and one is the pantoum. Both of these poems include repetition, but they include repetition of different kinds. So for example, the pantoum, which you can open up and look at as you're listening to this video, or you can look at it later on. But the pantoum formula is a specific, the whole lines are repeated in a specific pattern. So each line that you write appears twice. One of the things that you might notice is that the first line and the last line are the same. That's because if we were to number the lines in the poem, which you'll see that I did here in a template for you, you'll see that if we have a 4-line stanza, which all pantoums have 4-line stanzas, you'll see that it's line 1, 2, 3, and 4. The next stanza makes what was the second line the first, and what was the 4th line the third, and then you write a new second and a new 4th. The next stanza takes what was in that second stanza, the second line, and makes it the first, and takes what was the 4th line and makes it the third, and you write a new second and 4th. You continue to do that for as long as you like. There's no specific stopping point. You could have 80 stanzas if you'd like to, but they have to follow that specific pattern. And then the final stanza is where it gets a little bit different. The final stanza has what was the second and 4th line of the previous stanza becomes the first and the third. But then you take what was the first and the third from the very first stanza, you flip them around, so what was the third becomes the second, and what was the first becomes the 4th. That's how you end up with the same line at the very beginning and the very end. My saying this is going to confuse the bejesus out of you, and it should, because that was just a lot of puzzle solving, and you shouldn't be able to follow along with what I'm saying just from that. That's why I have the template for you to follow, and I also have some examples for you to follow. I'm going to read one of the examples now. This is Liebchen. This was written by a former Southern student. She was an older student when she wrote this. She may have been in graduate school. I'm not 100% sure, but this is called Liebchen, a pantoum for Eva Braun. Eva Braun was Hitler's lover, if you're not, or mistress, if you're not aware of that. So a little context for you. What made you love him, Eva, your Adolf der Fuhrer, kissing and caressing while countless died, your Adolf der Fuhrer, gentleman monster, while countless died, you held hands, whispered vows. Gentleman monster, in the bunker under Berlin, you held hands, whispered vows. He took a bullet, you took your poison. In a bunker under Berlin, kissing and caressing, he took a bullet, you took your poison. What made you love him, Eva? So you may, and it could be Ava, I could be saying it wrong, but you'll notice that what made you love him, Eva, what made you love him, Ava, is the first and the last line. And if you listen closely to how I was reading that, you'll recognize the repetition of some of those other lines. The tricky thing about this poem is that you do have to follow that exact pattern. And the sentences or lines have to be exactly the same. You can change some of the punctuation, but the words have to appear in the exact same order in both times it appears. So that can be a little tricky, and sometimes the really difficult part happens at the very end in that last stanza. Sometimes it's sort of the luck of how those lines fall. So you may find that if that last stanza doesn't make sense because you aren't able to include new lines there, all of those lines have appeared before, that's where it gets really tricky. You can go back and look at how you arranged the previous lines and see if it makes sense to edit it at all so that that last stanza works. A lot of students choose to do the pantoum in an assignment where I offer that as an option because it is one that can be short, but I will warn you, it still takes a great deal of time and a great deal of puzzle solving, and kind of, it feels like math a little bit. So, you know, I urge you to really think about your topics and which form suits your ideas better than just length, because even though it is short, it is complicated. So that's the pantoum. Your other option is a sestina. A sestina, a good way of remembering, ses meaning six. It's a six line, it's a 6-line stanza, and there are 6 of those stanzas. So then you have one more stanza, which is 3 lines at the end, which is called an envoy. So in total you have 7 stanzas, but 6 of them are 6 lines. You also have 6 words that end each of your lines in a specific pattern. So for example, I will read another student poem. I won't read the whole thing. I'll let you read that on your own. It is a lovely poem that I urge you all to read, and it was written by a Southern student. Here's my internet again. So sorry for that. You guys have been more than patient. Let's see. Okay, here we go. This is called Sestina for Patricia. Oh no, it's not gonna let me do it. Let's see. Okay. Sestina to Patricia. This is by Rayon Lennon, or R.D. Lennon, he sometimes goes by. Dear Patricia, I have housed you in my mind these years, that's one end word, across acres of time and shiny ocean stillness. Stillness is the second word. That merged old age and new innocence. Innocence is the third. How you swung hands with me, my love, that's the fourth. The island was summer and we were young, that's the fifth. After school on a Friday afternoon, a light breeze is 6. It's breeze. So we have years, stillness, innocence, love, young, and breeze. Those are our 6 words. Now listen to stanza 2. A moment unfolding in the fluttering breeze, shedding your school blue uniform, only 13 years into your life, kissing me wildly, the young birds chirping from the shady alders, my fingers stilled, electric nerves on your cool night skin, with love taking you one step farther from your innocence. The only change here in these end words is that what he's done here is called a loose sestina, where stillness in the first stanza becomes stilled in the second. Now he does that through the poem. He will change the tense a bit. So it's stillness, then it's stilled, then it's still. Sometimes young becomes youth. There's even a point where innocence becomes incense. So that is really taking liberty here with the form, where he's used a word that sounds similar enough to the ear, but it is a completely different word and it doesn't have the same root. So take a look at this poem. It is a longer poem because, as I said, there are 6 6-line stanzas and then 1 3-line envoy. The words, the end words, have to appear in a very specific pattern. All of that's mapped out for you in the details of the assignment if you look at all the documents that I attached, including a template that you can use while writing out your poem. So, for example, he has years, stillness, innocence, love, young, breeze. Then they end as breeze, years, young, stilled, love, innocence. Then they end as innocence, breeze, love, years, still, youth. Then youth, incense, still, incense, still, breeze, years, loving. Sorry, I'm still having trouble with my voice after my cold. And he continues in that way. Follow that form exactly. Now here's another tricky thing. Yes, every single line has to end with those same words and in that same pattern. That's the tricky part. But unlike the Pantoum, you can write whatever you want up until that ending word. So for some people, they find this to be a more flexible poem because it doesn't have, it's not as rigid in its structure. Yes, you have those end words, but everything building up to those end words can be different. And because you don't have the repetition of whole lines, it can move in a way that the Pantoum doesn't. Some types of poems that work Some types of poems that work best with a sestina are narrative poems, telling a story like this one does. This tells a story of a young man and a young woman. It really seems like probably when they lose their virginity, but a first love. And so it tells a story. Now this works really well in that way because the form allows you to grow and develop and build rather than having this kind of circular motion that happens in a Pantoum. For the Pantoum, things that work really well with that form are things that we naturally think of in that sort of circular way. For example, those things that wake you up at 2 a.m. and you can't go back to sleep because you're thinking about it. Maybe a conversation you had that's really bothering you and weighing on you. Maybe a decision that you made that you wish you'd done something different, or one of those times that you had a situation with a person or even a confrontation with a person and you wish that you'd said something different. You can use that and write about it, and maybe even write the alternative ending. Like, what would have happened if you'd said something different? You know, you can start out by painting the picture in one way and then moving into this alternate ending. So that's a possibility for that. Sometimes relationship poems work well in this, you know, where there's it begins one way and then ends in another, and there's that kind of messiness between. That can work really well with a pantoum, because the thing is, and I'll draw a little diagram here while I knock everything off my table. The thing is, if you think of a pantoum as starting in the beginning, it comes back and hits that same line, but then it goes somewhere else, and then it comes back and hits that same line, and then it goes somewhere else, and then it comes back and hits that same line, but it goes somewhere else. So it's not exactly, it's more of like a coil. It's a terrible drawing. Now you know my only weakness is my artistic abilities, but it's more of like a coil, or like a slinky you can think of, or like, you know, if you've ever seen a phone that had a cord, that kind of, you know, spiral, or coil, rather than just a circle, because it comes back to touch that same spot. It's true, but then it goes somewhere else. There's still some momentum. There's still some movement. It doesn't always just come back to the same spot again and again and again to make a circle. So, so I want you to think about that as you're writing. Be sure that there is some momentum and some progression in the poem. I'll give you an example of a time that I used a pantoum to my advantage. I'll give you an example of both of those actually, but a pantoum, because it has that circular motion, I wrote a poem about my granddad, and I think I told you guys about my granddad. He was the one that served in World War II, and I think I shared this story about him when we looked at the Randall Jarrell poem, Death of Walter a Gunner. And the reason why I wanted to write about him is because he's really special to me. Oh, and I know I also shared the story of him and Candy, the sense memory thing. So anyway, he was really a special person to me, and I wanted to honor him in some way. And he was, you know, somewhat of a war hero, certainly in our state, if not the country. And one of the reasons why he was considered to be a world hero is because he was a World War II hero, is because he was a medic. And he told me this story about, and he didn't tell me many stories about being in the war, I think because I was a girl. He told my brother's stories, but he wouldn't tell me and my sister's stories because it was intense, and he didn't think that was, you know, appropriate storytelling for young women, which, you know, I mean, different time, right? Different generation. So, so he tells me the story about a time that they were under heavy fire, and he and another guy were in a foxhole, and, you know, avoiding active fire, being protected, and then he heard somebody yell, "Help." And he stayed there. It's like, "Oh, help." And then he said, "Medic, medic." And he was really torn and thought, "I need to go and help him. He's calling for the medic, and that's me. But if I get up, I could be killed." And then they actually said his name. They said, "Baker, Baker." And he said, "If they say your name, you have to go." You know, like you can't just ignore a man who is in need if he's calling you specifically. So he got up and he ran over to the man, and he was fine. He got there safely. But when he got to the man, it was clear that he was not going to survive. He said his chest was open. He could see his heart. You could see his heart beating and slowing and slowing. And he just stayed with him. Because, you know, I mean, the man knew he wasn't going to survive. I mean, he had to have enough awareness in that moment that he was probably going to die, but he didn't want to die alone. And he called for the only person he thought could help him. So as my grandfather's telling me the story, his hand is, I'll move my hand so you can see, his hand is on the table, and he's sort of like moving like his fist a little bit, like opening and closing his hand. And I noticed that he was doing this as he was telling the whole story, but I didn't really think anything of it. And then I realized as we got to the end of the story that he was mimicking the man's heart beating. So I decided to write about this moment of hearing this story, and I tried for years to write about it, but I'm not someone who's ever served in a war, so there was this inability to write about it in any sort of authentic way. Every time I tried to write about it from the perspective of somebody who had been in a war, it just came across as like a book report or something. Like it just felt, it really lacked emotion, and it lacked connection. It lacked any sort of understanding or ability to relate to the situation. So that kept my readers from being able to relate to the situation. Well, then I tried to write it from my perspective as this young person who idolized my grandfather and heard this story that just, I couldn't believe that anybody had experienced anything like this. And it was too emotional because I felt too much for him, and it was too hard for me not to make it cliche and over sentimental. So finally, after years of working on this poem and trying to get this idea on the page, I read a Pantoum and thought, oh, maybe that's how I could do it. Maybe just by using that form and that structure, I can rein in the emotion a little bit, like have people have the form kind of take control, so there is some emotion to it and there's some facts to it, like historical information, but because it's happening in this form, everything is kind of held together by something else, so it's not too much of anything. And I don't know if it I mean, that's the version of it that I like the most. And the line that began and ended the poem was, he opened and closed his hand. He opened and closed his fist. And that was the first line, and that was the last line, which acted as sort of bookends for everything that came in between, which was the telling of the story and me watching him tell the story. So I had both of those perspectives, because each time a line appeared, it was appearing in a new way, and it was surrounded by new lines that could make it appear in a new way. So that's something that is really challenging about the Pantoum, but also kind of fun to do. So if you have a story that is kind of hard to tell, that might be a good form for you. For a sestina, sometimes I like to write sestinas as a brainstorming session for when I have writer's block, because I'll start with a stanza, and then because I have those words that are required at the end of each line, that kind of helps me, kind of guides me. I sort of surrender to the form and just kind of free flow, write what comes to mind using those ending words. And sometimes I finish it and I look back and I'm like, oh, I actually really like this fourth stanza. I'm going to take that and throw away the rest and build a new poem around this fourth stanza. So, I mean, sometimes that happens with the Sestina where it's more of an exercise in writing, but I have written a few, and most of the ones that I write are narrative poems. This is another time where if you're writing about something that's kind of emotional, it helps to have that form rein it in a little bit. So those are some suggestions and ideas for things you can do with the Pantoum and the Sestina. And I really hope that this video posts now that I've just been talking 25 minutes. And I hope that it helps you all. Please do read through all the documents that I've included. It's necessary, and also have them next to you when you're writing, because even somebody like myself who's written several poems in both of these forms and has taught the forms, I still have to refer to those formulas. I don't trust my memory with it because it is very complicated. The other thing I want to point out is that I'm giving you this information now, even though the poem is not due until October 11th at class time, because I want you to have plenty of time to work on it. I don't need to know if you write your poems 2 minutes before you hand them in. That's not any information that I need to know. We've all done it. Maybe that's what you do, maybe it's not. But I urge you not to do that this time, because it is a type of poem that takes a lot of careful planning, a lot of time, a lot of consideration, and a lot of patience. So really give yourself plenty of time to work on it. Go back to it, edit it, revise, whatever it is that you feel you need to do. And of course, you can always email me and ask questions or hang out at the end of class. Sometimes people do that when we have a Zoom. They stick around and we can talk a little bit during that time. So that's that. Again, that will be due on October 11th. And when we get together on Thursday, we will we'll begin our workshop for poem number 3. Okay? Thanks y'all so much. Thanks for being so flexible. This is really, as I said in my message, really one of those when it rains, it pours kind of, well, really months, but it's affected you guys these last 2 classes. So thank you for your patience, and we just got to do our best, right? All right, take care. Bye.